Welcome to Boring History, where forgotten echoes of the past find their place. Today, we journey back to June 1800, to a dusty Italian plain where Napoleon Bonaparte staked everything on one desperate gamble. The Battle of Marengo wasn't just a clash of armies. It was the moment that reshaped Europe's destiny. In the spring of 1800, Europe once again stood on the edge of transformation as Napoleon Bonaparte, recently risen to the role of First Consul of France, faced the challenge of reshaping both his own destiny and that of the nation he now guided. His enemies believed they had him cornered, thinking the French Republic was weakened after years of relentless wars that had drained its resources, shaken its allies, and left its armies scattered across far-flung fronts. Austria, determined to reassert its dominance in northern Italy and roll back French influence, had pressed its advantage with speed and force, capturing key positions and threatening to lock the French out of the Italian peninsula entirely. For Napoleon, this was not simply a strategic setback, but a direct blow to the political legitimacy he had carefully constructed. To hold power at home, to maintain his image as France's savior, he needed not just words or reforms, but a decisive stroke that would astonish Europe and remind his opponents, both within and beyond France, that he was no ordinary general. The idea Napoleon conceived was as audacious as it was dangerous. He would not follow the expected lines of movement, nor would he attempt the safer routes through southern France or along the coast. Instead, he would strike where his enemies least expected, carrying the core of his army through the seemingly impassable barrier of the Alps, descending suddenly into Italy and taking the Austrian forces by surprise. To the modern mind, accustomed to the mobility of tanks, airplanes, and modern logistics, such a maneuver might not immediately reveal its difficulty. But in 1800, with armies dependent on horses, men's endurance, and slow-moving supply chains, to attempt such a crossing was to gamble everything on nature's most formidable defenses. The Alps were more than mountains. They were walls of ice and rock, capped by snow, swept by bitter winds, with passes so treacherous that even mules struggled to find footing. The Austrian generals, trained in the art of methodical campaigns, assumed no rational commander would dream of leading tens of thousands of troops across such hostile terrain, and so they left the northern approaches relatively unguarded. That assumption was precisely what Napoleon intended to exploit. The plan required meticulous preparation, and here Napoleon's genius for organization revealed itself. Rather than move blindly into the mountains, he orchestrated a vast logistical effort, ensuring that supplies, artillery, and food would be available at every stage of the journey. Cannons, which no enemy expected to see hauled across icy ridges, were carefully disassembled, loaded onto sledges, and dragged by teams of men and mules along paths barely wide enough for a single traveler. Grain and bread, dried meats, wine, and the endless necessities of an army were stockpiled in advance, distributed to local depots, and prepared for rapid movement. The troops were told as little as possible until the last moment, for secrecy was critical. Word of Napoleon's intended movement, if it reached Austrian ears, might prompt a countermeasure that would render the entire effort futile. The French people themselves were kept in suspense, hearing rumors of great plans but knowing nothing of the direction their first consul would take. Napoleon cultivated this aura of mystery deliberately, for he knew that surprise was the most powerful weapon at his disposal. In May, the movement began, and what followed became one of the most extraordinary feats in the annals of military history. The men of the French army, veterans hardened by years of campaigning, found themselves ordered not into battle but into the heart of the mountains, where snow still lay thick and avalanches thundered without warning. They marched single file along precarious ridges, boots slipping on frozen ground, their breath visible in the thin, cold air. Many wore uniforms ragged from previous campaigns, threadbare coats offering little protection against the biting winds. Yet discipline held, for they trusted in the name of Napoleon, and his presence among them acted as a kind of living flame, warming their resolve even as their bodies froze. When morale threatened to flag, Napoleon would appear in person, riding his horse with an air of calm assurance, speaking to the soldiers not with lofty speeches, but with brief words that reminded them of their strength, their glory, and the victory that awaited them beyond the mountains. The most famous segment of this passage came at the Great St. Bernard Pass, a high and treacherous route that had long been used only by merchants and hardy travelers willing to risk its dangers. At over 8,000 feet above sea level, it was hardly suited to an army of 30,000 men, yet it was precisely this impossibility that made it the perfect avenue for Napoleon's design. The French soldiers laboured for days, dragging their artillery over icy slopes with ropes, pulleys, and wooden sledges specially constructed for the task. Horses collapsed, mules slipped into ravines, and men themselves perished under the strain, yet the army pressed on. In some sections, the path narrowed so drastically that only one soldier could pass at a time, and when a cannon had to be moved, entire companies had to halt, wait, and then help push the burden forward with their combined strength. Every foot gained felt like a victory, every ridge conquered like the overcoming of an impossible barrier. Local monks from the hospice at the summit offered aid, providing bread, cheese, and wine to the exhausted soldiers, but even their efforts could not soften the sheer hardship of the journey. The soldiers slept in the open, wrapped in blankets stiff with frost, waking to continue the march as the dawn revealed an endless landscape of snow and jagged rock. Frostbite claimed fingers and toes, avalanches buried supply wagons, and storms swept down without warning, yet the army endured. They sang songs to keep their spirits alive, told each other stories of past victories, and looked always to the figure of Napoleon, who seemed untouched by fatigue or fear. Whether he truly felt such calm, or whether he projected it deliberately as a performance for the sake of morale, remains a matter of debate. But what mattered to the men was that their leader seemed unbreakable, and so they strove to match him. As the army descended on the far side, into the Italian plain, the Austrians were struck with disbelief. Reports reached their commanders that Napoleon had accomplished the impossible, appearing where no enemy should have been able to appear. Entire Austrian plans collapsed in a moment, for their assumption of security in the north had left them vulnerable, and now an entire French army loomed behind their lines. The strategic brilliance of the maneuver lay not simply in the crossing itself, but in the timing. By arriving suddenly in Italy, Napoleon forced the Austrians to divert attention and troops away from their offensives, buying critical breathing space for the French forces already engaged in the region. It was not merely a march through mountains. It was a stroke of psychological warfare, a revelation to both allies and enemies that Napoleon could and would defy the conventions of military thought. Turning nature itself into a weapon, contemporary observers struggled to capture the significance of what they witnessed. Some likened Napoleon to Hannibal, who centuries earlier had crossed the Alps with elephants to strike at Rome, though Napoleon himself dismissed such comparisons, claiming that his achievement was greater, since Hannibal had not faced modern artillery and the demands of 18th century logistics. Others saw in the passage a kind of mythic quality, an image of destiny embodied in the figure of the French leader striding, where no man dared. In later years, artists would immortalize the scene in dramatic canvases, most famously Jacques, Louis David's painting of Napoleon on a rearing horse, cloaked in billowing fabric, pointing the way forward. In truth, Napoleon crossed on a humble mule, bundled against the cold, but the myth mattered more than the reality, for it conveyed the essence of the act: audacity, vision, and the will to impose human determination upon nature's barriers. The march did not come without cost, for many soldiers were lost to exposure, exhaustion, and accidents, and yet the overall success outweighed the suffering. The French army emerged from the mountains battered but unbroken, ready to descend into the plains of northern Italy and confront the Austrians on ground of Napoleon's choosing. The speed of the movement astonished the watching world, for within weeks Napoleon had transformed a desperate strategic situation into an opportunity for decisive battle. What had seemed impossible in April became reality in May, and the balance of power in Europe shifted once more in France's favour. For Napoleon personally, the feat cemented his reputation as a master of bold manoeuvres, a leader who could imagine what others dismissed, and then make it real through sheer force of will and organizational genius. To his enemies, it was a warning that no frontier, no natural defense, could be considered safe as long as Napoleon Bonaparte commanded the armies of France. On the morning of June 14, 1800, The fields near the small village of Marengo in northern Italy became the stage for one of the most dramatic shifts of fortune in European military history. Napoleon had completed his daring Alpine crossing and descended with his army into the plains. But what awaited him was not the easy victory he had hoped for. The Austrians, under General Michael von Melas, had regrouped with determination and prepared to strike a blow that would not only reverse the French incursion, but potentially crush Napoleon's position entirely. From the first hours of daylight, the balance of power leaned heavily in favor of the Austrian forces, and by midday their success seemed all but assured. As the French army, taken by surprise and pressed with relentless force, reeled backward under the weight of superior numbers, the Austrian plan unfolded with precision. Melas, an aging but experienced commander, recognized that the French position was vulnerable, stretched thin along the plains, and dependent on the element of surprise that had carried them into Italy. If the Austrians could strike swiftly and force the French into retreat, the momentum gained from Napoleon's Alpine gamble would collapse. Melas ordered a massive offensive, deploying around 30,000 men against Napoleon's smaller force of approximately 22,000. The Austrian columns advanced with the confidence of soldiers who believed they were about to secure not just a battlefield triumph, but the destruction of an entire campaign. The sheer weight of numbers favored them, and their approach was methodical, with infantry supported by cavalry and a powerful artillery train that had been positioned to dominate the flat terrain around Marengo. At first, the French held their ground, forming defensive lines around the village and the shallow streams that cut across the plain. Napoleon's troops, veterans of earlier campaigns, fought with their characteristic discipline, but the Austrian pressure was overwhelming. As the morning hours passed, Austrian units surged forward, forcing the French to yield ground step by step. The thunder of cannon fire echoed across the countryside, mingling with the cries of wounded men and the clash of bayonets in close combat. Smoke drifted over the fields, obscuring vision, turning the battle into a chaos of half-seen movements and sudden eruptions of violence. Austrian cavalry swept against French flanks, breaking through in places and scattering units that attempted to regroup. The village of Marengo itself, fiercely contested, changed hands multiple times as each side hurled men into its narrow streets and stone buildings, fighting house by house, doorway by doorway. By midday, the Austrian advantage was clear. Napoleon's carefully laid plans to lure the Austrians into a trap seemed in danger of unraveling, for instead of overextending themselves into a vulnerable position, the Austrians were pressing relentlessly, driving the French back across the plain. Reports reached Napoleon that entire divisions were faltering, their lines bent under the pressure of repeated assaults. Ammunition supplies dwindled as the French gunners exhausted their shot, and infantry units, forced into repeated counterattacks, began to lose cohesion. Austrian artillery pounded the French positions mercilessly, cutting bloody swaths through their ranks. The balance of morale tilted. French soldiers who had endured the freezing heights of the Alps only weeks before now faced the bitter prospect of defeat on the sunny plains of Italy. Napoleon himself remained calm outwardly, though those close to him later recalled the tension in his gaze, the quiet intensity with which he scanned the battlefield for signs of opportunity. He rode among his men, speaking few words but urging them to hold fast, to buy time, to trust that the moment for reversal would come. Yet the reality was grim. Melas's forces surged forward with increasing confidence, their ranks swelling as fresh reinforcements arrived from the rear. The French, by contrast, were stretched thin, forced to rely on improvisation and desperate acts of courage by officers who rallied their men again and again in the face of near collapse. The Austrians believed victory was within their grasp. By the middle of the day, their lines had advanced so far that Napoleon's army appeared to be in full retreat. French troops fell back in disorder, some abandoning artillery pieces they could no longer drag across the muddy fields, others breaking ranks as the weight of Austrian cavalry bore down upon them. In Vienna, Melas's superiors anticipated good news. The French invasion, it seemed, would be broken in a single decisive battle. Melas himself, exhausted by the morning's exertions and confident that the outcome was assured, began delegating command to his subordinates, certain that the final stages of the battle required little more than mopping up resistance. It was a decision that would later be remembered as one of the crucial turning points of the entire campaign. But at midday it reflected the apparent reality. The Austrians had achieved what they set out to do, and the French were on the brink of collapse. For the soldiers on the ground, the scene was one of exhaustion and despair. French regiments retreated through fields trampled by horses, littered with the fallen, and scarred by cannon fire. The cries of the wounded mixed with the commands of officers attempting to restore order. Units that had fought side by side through years of campaigning were reduced to fragments, bands of survivors clinging to one another in the hope of finding safety. Cavalry charges splintered infantry formations, driving men into the ditches and streams where they drowned or were cut down in flight. Austrian soldiers pressed forward with grim determination, their bayonets gleaming in the summer sun, their drums and bugles sounding the advance that promised imminent triumph. Napoleon's position at midday seemed almost untenable. His forces were pushed back several miles from their original lines, and the Austrians controlled the key ground around Marengo. His reserves were limited, his lines of communication threatened, and his men weary from hours of fighting under relentless pressure. For a general who had built his reputation on swift, decisive victories, the prospect of defeat carried not only military consequences, but political ones as well. News of a loss at Marengo would reverberate through France, undermining his authority as first consul and emboldening his enemies both within and beyond the Republic. The stakes of the battle, already immense, grew heavier with each passing moment as the clock moved through the noon hours and the Austrian grip tightened. Yet even as Austrian confidence swelled, cracks in their cohesion began to emerge. The very success of their advance created overextension as units pressed farther forward in pursuit of retreating French forces. The flat, open terrain offered few natural defences, and while Austrian columns pushed ahead, their lines of communication stretched thin, their artillery lagged behind, and their coordination began to falter. Still, at midday, these weaknesses were not yet apparent to most observers. What was visible was the dominance of the Austrian position, the impression of near total victory over an enemy who seemed unable to withstand the onslaught. Austrian officers spoke of the battle as if it were already won, issuing orders for pursuit and preparing to consolidate their hold over the territory they had reclaimed for Napoleon's soldiers. The hours around midday were among the darkest of their military careers. The proud army of the reserve, which had crossed the Alps with such daring, now appeared to be crumbling in the face of Austrian determination. French colours that once inspired fear and respect across Europe fluttered amid smoke and confusion, their bearers cut down by musket fire or trampled beneath cavalry charges. Entire companies disappeared into the chaos, swallowed by the ebb and flow of battle. Survivors clung to the belief that their general would find a way, that Napoleon would conjure some miracle as he had so many times before. But the reality before their eyes was of steady retreat, of bloodied comrades falling one after another, of fields transformed into graveyards beneath the summer sun. The Austrians pressed their advantage with all the vigour of men who believed history was about to bend in their favour. Their columns advanced across the plain, drums beating, banners unfurled, as if to announce their triumph to the world. They could see the French lines bending, hear the cries of retreat, feel the momentum of victory coursing through their ranks. For them, midday at Marengo was a moment of vindication, proof that discipline and superior numbers could triumph over audacity and surprise. Officers rode along the lines, encouraging their men to push harder, promising that the French would soon be driven completely from the field. Soldiers shouted in exultation, their morale surging with each step forward, their belief in imminent triumph unshakable all the while. Napoleon's headquarters was a scene of grim resolve. Staff officers brought him reports of collapsing positions, of commanders requesting reinforcements that did not exist, of men fighting to the last cartridge and then resorting to bayonets before being overwhelmed. Napoleon listened in silence, his expression unreadable, his mind racing to calculate possibilities, to measure time, to gauge the balance between defeat and salvation. He knew that battles were not always won by those who seemed strongest at midday, that the tide of war could shift in a heartbeat, But he also knew that without a stroke of fortune or a decisive intervention, his army stood on the edge of ruin. Still, he gave no sign of despair, for he understood that the morale of thousands depended on his composure, on the image of a leader who never doubted, never faltered, even when the world seemed to collapse around him, as the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the battered fields of Marengo. The French army seemed poised for defeat. The Austrian forces under General Melas had pressed them relentlessly since morning, driving them back mile after mile until the very survival of Napoleon's campaign appeared doubtful. Soldiers who had crossed the Alps with him only weeks before now staggered under exhaustion, their uniforms torn, their ammunition depleted, their morale fraying with every step of retreat. Austrian cavalry thundered across the plains, scattering broken regiments, while infantry columns advanced steadily with the weight of numbers behind them. To observers on both sides, the verdict of the day appeared nearly written. Napoleon, master of audacity, would taste bitter defeat on Italian soil. And yet, in that moment of peril, a reversal began to take shape, born not of chance alone, but of calculation, resilience, and the sudden arrival of reinforcements, whose presence transformed despair into triumph. Napoleon's genius, often misunderstood as pure improvisation, rested on his ability to anticipate possibilities others dismissed. Even as his army faltered under Austrian pressure, he had not entirely abandoned the hope of turning the battle. Hours earlier, he had dispatched messages to hasten the approach of General Desaix, commanding a reserve force detached from the main army. Desaix, a soldier of reputation, had marched swiftly to rejoin his commander, and by late afternoon his column drew near the battlefield. The timing could not have been more critical. Exhausted French soldiers, falling back through fields littered with the dead, suddenly glimpsed fresh ranks arriving, their bayonets gleaming, their uniforms unsoiled by the day's carnage. The sight revived spirits on the verge of collapse, for it signaled that the army was not abandoned, that the battle was not yet decided. Desaix himself carried a calm, almost prophetic demeanor. Upon hearing the state of the field, he is reported to have remarked, "This battle is completely lost, but there is still time to win another." His words encapsulated the paradox of the moment, for while the French lines lay shattered, the opportunity for counterattack had emerged from the very confidence of the Austrians. In their belief that victory was secured, the Austrian forces had advanced deep into the French position, their lines stretched, their formations uneven. Melas, wary and convinced of success, had even delegated active command to his subordinates, retreating from the front in anticipation of final reports of triumph. It was into this climate of overconfidence that Desaix and Napoleon prepared to unleash their decisive stroke. The French counterattack began with artillery. General Marmont, commanding the guns, had concentrated his batteries with ruthless efficiency, gathering what pieces remained serviceable and positioning them to deliver maximum effect against the Austrian advance. The flat plain around Marengo offered no shelter, and as the French cannon roared to life, iron shot tore through Austrian ranks already loosened by pursuit. Cavalry horses screamed as volleys ripped into their formations. Infantry columns recoiled under the sudden weight of fire, and the momentum of the Austrian advance faltered for the first time that day. The sound of the artillery seemed to roll across the battlefield like thunder, a reminder that the French army still possessed teeth, that it was not yet ready to dissolve into defeat. Desaix then led his infantry forward. His men, fresh compared to their exhausted comrades, marched in disciplined ranks, bayonets fixed, muskets ready, their advance steady and relentless. They struck at the heart of the Austrian pursuit, aiming to halt and then reverse its course. The shock of their appearance reverberated through the Austrian lines, for here was an enemy they had not expected, a force that appeared suddenly where moments earlier there had been only fragments of retreating soldiers. Austrian commanders scrambled to reorient their men, shouting orders above the din, attempting to wheel their columns to face the new threat. But confusion spread quickly, as units already engaged in pursuit now found themselves vulnerable to counterattack. The fighting reached its fiercest intensity as Desaix's men clashed with Austrian infantry. Muskets fired at close range, smoke enveloped the fields, and bayonets locked in brutal hand-to-hand combat. Desaix himself, always at the front, fell in the opening moments, struck by a musket ball that killed him instantly. His loss was devastating to those who knew him, for he was beloved as both a commander and a comrade, yet his men, far from breaking, were galvanized by his sacrifice, driving forward with renewed fury as if determined to honor his memory with victory. Napoleon, upon hearing of Desaix's fall, said to have suppressed his grief instantly, understanding that the fate of the battle allowed no indulgence of emotion. He pressed the attack harder, urging his soldiers to seize the moment before Austrian cohesion could be restored alongside the infantry. French cavalry under General Kellerman charged with devastating effect. Spotting a gap opening in the Austrian line, Kellerman led his squadrons forward in a thunderous assault, sabres flashing, horses pounding across the trampled earth. The Austrians, already unsettled by artillery and infantry counterattacks, now faced a wall of cavalry crashing into their flanks. Entire units dissolved under the impact, men scattering in panic, banners falling into French hands. What had been moments earlier a confident advance began to unravel into disorder as officers struggled in vain to restore control. The psychological effect was immense. Soldiers who had believed themselves victors now felt the weight of defeat pressing suddenly upon them. Napoleon himself directed the unfolding counterstroke with the precision of a conductor guiding an orchestra. He shifted reserves into key points, reinforced the artillery barrage, and ensured that the momentum of the attack never slackened. His presence on the field, calm and commanding, inspired his wary soldiers to summon strength they did not know they possessed. Men who had marched backward all morning now surged forward, driven by the belief that the tide had turned, that destiny once again favored their cause. Shouts of "Vive la République!" echoed across the field, mingling with the clash of steel and the thunder of cannon. The transformation in morale was as striking as the shift in tactics. Despair melted into determination, exhaustion into exhilaration. The Austrians, for their part, struggled to comprehend the sudden reversal. Their columns, extended deep into French territory, found themselves isolated from one another, unable to coordinate effectively. Artillery pieces, dragged too far forward in pursuit, were overrun or abandoned. Cavalry units, dispersed in chasing retreating French, could not regroup quickly enough to counter Kellerman's charges. Melas, absent from the immediate field, was slow to grasp the scale of the collapse, and his subordinates, caught in the whirlwind of French aggression, issued conflicting orders that only deepened the chaos. Soldiers who had marched confidently only hours earlier now stumbled back in confusion, their ranks shredded by fire, their formations pierced by cavalry, their morale collapsing with every passing moment. The battlefield became a scene of astonishing contrast. On one side, French soldiers who had tasted near defeat fought with the ferocity of men given a second life, pressing forward with every ounce of energy. On the other, Austrian troops who had all but celebrated victory found themselves overwhelmed by panic, their cohesion dissolving as they sought desperately to escape the tightening grip of Napoleon's counterattack. The fields around Marengo, already littered with the fallen from the morning's fighting, now became the stage for the disintegration of an army. Cannon smoke thickened the air, the cries of the wounded rose above the din, and the ground shook with the continuous pounding of cavalry and artillery. By late afternoon, the transformation was undeniable. The Austrians, who only hours earlier had stood on the brink of triumph, were in retreat, driven back across the plain by the relentless French advance. Napoleon's counterstroke, orchestrated with perfect timing and executed with ruthless energy, had turned disaster into victory. His soldiers, reinvigorated by the arrival of Desaix and the thunder of Marmont's artillery, pressed their advantage with merciless determination, ensuring that the Austrians could not regroup or mount a final stand. What had begun as a rout of the French became, by evening, a rout of their enemies. The balance of the campaign overturned in a single astonishing reversal. The memory of Marengo would linger in the minds of all who witnessed it, not merely for the scale of the combat, but for the drama of its reversal. Soldiers who had felt the weight of defeat in the morning now carried the pride of victory at night, their exhaustion tempered by the knowledge that they had endured the brink of ruin and emerged triumphant. Austrian veterans, who had marched confidently into the battle certain of success, carried with them the bitter taste of opportunity lost, of a victory squandered in the moment of its grasp. For Napoleon, the counterattack at Marengo confirmed the essence of his reputation, the ability to bend the course of events when all seemed lost, to seize the fleeting moment and transform it into destiny.